Guitarists all recognize the clearly different distortion qualities from the different tubes used in various guitar amps, but many people are not all that aware of the distinctions among the different types of distortion that are produced by various analog components in the studio. While they may notice the clearly more edgy quality of digital clipping, as opposed to traditional analog harmonic distortion, they may not be so familiar with the more subtle variations in harmonic distortion between those various components. But it would be a mistake to think of all distortion as the same. The differences are what lends so many vintage analog processors, and the best digital simulations of them, their unique character. It wouldn't be a bad thing to have a decent familiarity with the various devices that are most commonly employed for distortion, both obvious and subtle, and the different distortion qualities they bring to the table. When many people think of analog distortion, they immediately think of tubes, which are probably the most well-known and widely used devices for generating distortion, to whatever degree. But tubes aren't the only game in town. When it comes to the distinct sound of everything from guitar amps to vintage audio processors, there are several components that may supply that extra oomph, from full-blown crunch to subtle warmth. Tubes, of course, are one of the main sources of desirable distortion, but so are transistors, of which there are several varieties commonly found in audio gear. Transistor distortion got a bad rap among guitarists when they were poorly implemented as replacements for guitar amp tubes in the early days, but they do lend their distinctive overdriven character to many circuits, from consoles to stomp boxes. A lesser-known contributor may be transformers, iron in engineering lingo, which may also bring their own, more subtle edge to the party, and are widely employed in all sorts of vintage gear. Even analog tape is the source of its own unique form of saturation, though I'll cover that later in the course. For now, let's take a brief look at the most common sources of distortion, different types of tubes and transistors, each of which offers its own particular distortion quality. I already talked a little about different tubes in a previous video in the context of guitar amps, but I'll do a brief review here. For audio applications, the two main types are triodes and pentodes. Triodes are typically used as preamp tubes. I mentioned one of the most ubiquitous models, the 12AX7, which is widely used for guitar amp preamp circuits, where, when driven hard, it produces a fairly bright, buzzy distortion quality, at least by guitar amp standards. But these are also the tubes of choice for applications where distortion is not the main event, but the side dish. Small amounts add that pleasant analog warmth and presence that audio people prize so much in vintage gear, modern clones, and virtual emulations. Utilized in all sorts of studio processors, like EQ, compressors, and the like, it's often the main ingredient for what many people think of as analog sound. For more overtly distorted applications, pentode tubes are typically employed as power tubes in guitar amps. Various American and British models are associated with the particular distortion qualities of certain classic amps, which serve as the templates for most designs. As I mentioned previously, 6V6 models used in vintage Fender Tweed amps from the 50s are known for a throaty distortion. Six L6s, associated with later Fender Blackface amps of the 60s, have a smoother, fatter distortion when pushed hard, and a glassy sound when driven lightly. EL34s lend Marshall amps and many rock and blues amps their mid-rangey, crunchy distortion character. While their smaller cousins, EL84s, power classic Vox amps, renowned for a unique, clear, and detailed distortion quality. Transistors, on the other hand, are often associated with harsher distortion, but again, that may be a bad rap they got when poorly utilized early on in place of tubes in some amps. Transistors can provide several flavors of their own brand of distortion that are equally desirable when used in a well-designed analog circuit, or a well-programmed digital simulation. Two places where transistors often contribute their version of analog tone are classic consoles and guitar stomp box distortion effects. In consoles, naturally, their contribution is very subtle. Subtle distortion and saturation is the topic for a later video, so I won't dwell on it here. In stomp boxes, various types of transistors, just like tubes, each lend their distinct distortion character to effects ranging from light overdrive to full-bore distortion to over-the-top fuzz. Transistor variants commonly used in guitar stomp boxes and other studio processors include germanium transistors, silicon transistors, op-amps, and FET or FET transistors. All of these are devices or circuits that are employed for clipping to produce distortion. The differences in quality are probably easiest to hear when they're used in overdrive or distortion pedals, where they're driven hard for heavier distortion effects. I'll cite some familiar stomp boxes as examples. Germanium transistors, an early design, have a somewhat smoother overdriven quality. Like most transistors, a little edgier than tube overdrive, but still desirable in both small and larger quantities. Besides their subtle use in some studio gear, which I'll mention later, they're known for supplying the fat distortion and early fuzz face pedals, most associated with early Hendrix recordings. Silicon transistors have a different, sharper edge distortion quality. More reliable and stable than germanium, they are widely used in many devices. Op-amps are more complex transistor-based circuits, also widely utilized for a variety of distortion sounds in various stomp boxes. The Ibanez Tube Screamer, despite the name, utilizes an op-amp for its more restrained, crunchy, somewhat tube-like overdrive. While the Rat, very popular in the 80s, subjects its op-amp to hard clipping for a more buzzy, distorted character. The kind of sound many people associate with generic transistor distortion. This famous stomp box utilizes cascading silicon diodes designed for the over-the-top transistor distortion usually categorized as fuzz. The Big Muff is one of the original and one of the classic fuzz boxes. FETs, field effect transistors, or FETs, are a later design with a smoother distortion characteristic that many people describe as closer to tube-like. In fact, they've been widely used in transistorized analog circuits that look to emulate tube overdrive, like the classic analog Sansamp pedals and racks. But they're also widely used in everything from studio processors to microphones, where they often color the sound in a pleasing way. A little later in the course, I'll come back to some of the studio gear that uses these same tube and transistor components for more subtle warmth and presence, rather than noticeable distortion. But first, since I've been focusing so much on guitar-oriented distortion applications, I want to talk about not thinking of distortion as an effect just for guitar, but utilizing it on other instruments as well.